You think winter is hard now. Try surviving it with no thermostat, no insulation, no second chances. In the Middle Ages, winter didn't knock on your door. It blew through it. And if you weren't ready, you didn't make it. But here's the truth. They didn't freeze in ignorance. They fought cold with architecture ash and animals. They turned mud into walls that breathed warmth, wool into armor that defied frost. They didn't wait for help. They remembered what worked. While we chased smart heating systems and backup generators, they dug underground, slept on hay, and lit the dark with fire made from fat. Crude maybe, but effective enough to keep whole villages alive. So before you laugh at the past, ask yourself, if the grid went down tonight, could you outlast a medieval peasant? Skill 1. Underground half-homes. The cold didn't just bite, it crept under doors, through walls, into bones. And so peasants didn't build higher, they dug lower. Across medieval Europe, from England to Poland, entire villages vanished beneath the soil on purpose. They built underground half-homes bearing the floor of their huts 3 to 4 feet below ground level. Not because it looked good, but because the earth holds warmth. A few feet down, soil maintains a stable temperature, about 50 to 55 degrees. It was the medieval version of geothermal heating. No wires, no vents, just dirt. And wisdom. They'd carve a pit-built stone or wood walls from within, then roof it over with branches, turf, and mud. Gaps were stuffed with straw and manure, a natural sealant better than anything sold in tubes today. They even angled doorways away from prevailing winds and added entrance tunnels that curved like a dragon's throat, not to intimidate, but to trap heat and block cold drafts. Some roofs sprouted grass, not for style, but to keep the straw layers from blowing away. Goats would graze up there. It worked. Today we call this earth-sheltered housing. We charge thousands for it. We make blueprints, run simulations. But they already knew. When the wind howled, they didn't fight it. They hid inside the earth and waited it out. No tech, no thermostat, just silent soil and survival. Skill 2. Wool-layered armor. Ao Giap, Lensong New Lop Winter didn't ask if you were ready. It just arrived. And in the medieval world, warmth wasn't optional. It was armor. Your first line of defense wasn't steel. It was wool. But not the soft-dyed, machine-woven wool, you know. No. Medieval peasants wore wool still soaked in lanolin, the oily natural grease straight from the sheep. It was rough, smelled like rain-soaked barn, but it repelled water-trapped heat and refused to quit. They didn't wear one thick coat. They layered like warriors. First came a long linen undershirt, often the only clean thing they owned. Then a wool tunic. Then another, a jerkin. A cloak, if they were lucky. Strips of wool wrapped around legs. Straps stuffed into boots. Even gloves, if you could call them that. Sacks tied over the hands with string. An average peasant wore 5 to 7 layers in peak winter. It wasn't fashion. It was insulation by desperation. And it worked. Why? Because each layer trapped a thin pocket of warm air. Modern science confirms several thin layers outperform one thick one. They knew it by instinct. And frostbite. They rarely wash their wool, because wet wool in freezing air becomes ice armor. One peasant reportedly washed his cloak once and watched it freeze solid standing up. It became a village joke, but also a warning. Today, outdoor gear costs hundreds and comes with charts tags, membranes. But in the 1300s, survival meant knowing if you can still move your arms, you're not wearing enough. Skill 3. Haybed survival systems. In winter, the ground didn't just feel cold, it stole heat. Slowly. Constantly. Mercilessly. Sleeping on bare earth meant waking up colder than when you lay down, or not waking up at all. That's why medieval peasants didn't sleep on beds. They slept in hay, not for comfort, For survival, a proper hay bed was built thick, up to 2 feet deep. Fresh-cut hay stored from summer was piled in layers directly on the dirt floor. It wasn't soft, it wasn't clean, but it was dry, at least for a little while. And that mattered, because hay isn't just straw, it's insulation. Packed tight, it traps air and lifts your body off the frozen ground. It absorbs moisture from breath and sweat, acting like a sponge beneath your skin. Then, every few nights, they'd rotate in new hay and burn or compost the old. Medieval families added anything they could find. Moss animal skins, torn clothes, to boost warmth. Some used dried herbs, not just for smell, but to repel fleas and soothe sore muscles. One man reportedly found a chicken egg in his hay bed after a cold night. They called it breakfast in bed. Not funny then, still not funny now, but it worked. In an age without mattresses, memory foam, or heated blankets, they made do with farm scraps and instinct. Today, we spend thousands on ergonomic support and climate-controlled sleep. They survived with hay sweat and a daily shakeout ritual to check for bugs, mice, or worse. Not glamorous, not cozy. But when the wind howled, the hay bed held. Skill 4. Ashbed heat banking. Fire was life, but it was fragile. One mistake, one forgotten ember, and your family froze. So medieval peasants became experts at keeping fire alive, even when it looked dead. Their secret ash. At night, when the cooking was done and the smoke settled, they didn't extinguish the fire. They buried it. A glowing coal or ember was carefully banked under several inches of ash, like tucking a baby into a crib of cold dust. Ash, dry and insulating, choked off oxygen but trapped heat. By morning, they could uncover the ember blow gently and reignite flame. No flint, no friction, just patience and practice. This wasn't superstition, it was survival chemistry. Today, bushcrafters call it ember banking. Tested, proven, still effective, because carrying fire is easier than remaking it. And when that ember did die, you didn't just shiver, you walked. One medieval story tells of a man who lost his ember overnight. So he carved a turnip into a fire. Safe Bull borrowed a coal from a neighbor and ran across fields in the snow to get home before it went cold. People thought he was possessed. He was just trying to stay alive. In a world without lighters, batteries, or fire starters, your ember was your insurance, your legacy, your link to warmth. So they whispered to their coals, banked them with reverence, and passed down the knowledge like sacred ritual. Because when fire died, people followed. Skill 5. Animal heatmates. The fire could die, but the animals kept breathing. When temperatures dropped below, freezing medieval peasants didn't just huddle by the fire, they invited the livestock in. It wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens, each one a mobile heat source. A cow gives off over 5,000 BTUs per hour, the equivalent of a small fireplace. A pig radiates warmth like a living furnace. Chickens at your feet meant insulated toes, and geese were better than watchdogs. In winter, 30% of the average medieval home was shared with animals. Low walls and barriers divided sleeping quarters from pens. Though the animals rarely respected the lines, they wandered, they snored, they heeded, and they warned. A single goose could wake the whole household at the sound of an unfamiliar footstep. A dog's growl in the night might stop a thief. Even a rooster, inconvenient as it was, functioned like an early alarm clock, and sometimes a personal enemy. Modern studies confirm it. A humid room feels up to 40 Fahrenheit warmer than a dry one. The breath of animals increased humidity, making cold air feel softer, warmer, bearable. Of course, it came at a cost: manure, smell, noise. You haven't known chaos until a pig steals from your soup, but it worked. Children slept next to lambs. Parents kept chickens beneath benches. Walls sweated, windows fogged, and no one froze. In today's world of zoning laws, smart thermostats, and pet-free apartments, we forget that survival once meant cohabiting with life itself, not as pets, but as partners in warmth. Skill 6. Tallow Firecraft. When the sun disappeared at 4 p.m., darkness didn't wait. And firelight wasn't luxury. It was time itself. In the medieval winter, peasants didn't waste fire on ambiance. They used every drop of light to survive. But candles were rare. Oil was expensive, so they made their own light. From the dead, they rendered animal fat, tallow, into fuel, boiled it down, skimmed off the impurities, and poured it into handmade clay lamps. No glass, no paraffin, just clay bowls and twisted cloth wicks. Some used dried moss soaked in fat. Others dipped rope into melted tallow, then hung it like a slow-burning fuse, a grease torch that could last through the night. It smelled like meat. It smoked like sin. But it worked. Tallow wasn't just for light. It gave warmth, slow, steady heat that didn't rely on wood or coal. And in desperate moments, a strip of leather soaked in fat became both food and fuel. In the modern world, we call it a survival candle or an emergency fat lamp. We sell kits, make videos, charge premium prices, but they did it first, with no matches, no metal, just knowledge. At night, families gathered around a single flickering flame, casting long shadows on soot-blackened walls, telling stories, sewing patches, stirring stew. It wasn't pretty. It was primitive, but primitive kept you alive. And when the fire ran low, they didn't panic. They reached for the fat and lit another night. Skill 7. Perpetual Stew Strategy. In winter, food wasn't just fuel. It was fire from within. And for medieval peasants, there was one dish that never ran out because it never ended. They called it Perpetual Stew, a pot hung over the hearth, always simmering, never emptied. Whatever they had, they threw in turnips, onions, cabbage scraps, wild herbs, dried meat, sometimes bark. If something edible existed, it went in the pot. The base was broth, often made from bones cracked open for marrow. Day by day, new ingredients were added, old ones melted in, flavor deepened, warmth stayed. It wasn't pretty, but it was practical. And warm food mattered more than taste. Families passed down stew pots like heirlooms. The older, the better, because the layers of soot and seasoning worked like memory. The pot remembered every winter and every hunger. Some stews boiled for weeks. One village kept the same base going for months, refilling it with roots grains, even pebbles for minerals. It became part soup, part ritual, and it was strategic. A hot pot meant a hot room. The stew humidified, the air softened, the smoke filled the house with steam and smell. Even if the rest of dinner was a crust of bread, you had warmth to inhale. Today, chefs call it bone broth. Campers call it one-pot cooking. Preppers call it genius. But medieval peasants just called it dinner. Every day, every night. A bubbling reminder that something warm was still possible. Because when the world outside froze, you didn't need variety. You needed heat. And something that wouldn't give up, even when you almost had. You've just traveled through 7 medieval techniques. No machines, no thermostats, no shortcuts. Just hay, fat, fire, memory. These weren't tricks. They were systems, built not with wealth, but with patience and pain. They didn't survive because they were stronger or smarter. They survived because they had no choice but to learn what worked and pass it on. They whispered to coals. They sealed walls with dung. They slept beside pigs, not because it was noble, but because dying of cold wasn't noble either. Today we heat with plastic circuits and Wi-Fi and forget everything that came before. But what happens when those fail? Because survival won't start with the gear you ordered. It'll start with what you remember: how to bank fire, how to layer warmth, how to live in the dark without fear. So ask yourself, if winter came and power didn't, would you know what to do, or would a medieval peasant outlast you?